The message came at 400 hours Earth Standard Time. It did not knock. It did not wait for an invitation. It pushed itself through every human communication channel at once: satellite relays, deep space beacons, emergency broadcast towers, private military feeds, and even the old public radio bands that most people had forgotten still existed. It arrived in 412 languages, translated perfectly, as if whoever sent it had spent a long time making sure there was no way to misunderstand it. The message was a declaration of war. The Galactic Sovereignty Conclave, 17 alien civilizations bound together by old agreements, older fears, and a shared belief that the galaxy worked better when someone was in charge of it, had made their decision. The truce was over. 3,000 years of cold, uncomfortable, quietly hostile peace had come to its end. The conclave was done waiting, done watching, and done pretending that humanity was something they could simply keep inside a box and hope it stayed small. The declaration was long. It listed grievances going back 8 centuries. It spoke of human expansion, of colony ships pushing past agreed borders, of research stations built in places the conclave considered sensitive, of a species that kept growing no matter how many quiet diplomatic warnings were sent. It used formal language, the kind of language that alien governments used when they wanted history to remember them as reasonable. But underneath all the careful words, the message was simple. It said, "We are coming and you should be afraid." 40,000 warships decloaked at the edge of human-controlled space at the exact moment the message finished broadcasting. They sat there, visible on every long-range scanner humanity had, arranged in perfect military formation. It was a show. It was meant to be a show. The conclave wanted people to see those ships and feel something cold move through them. In the city of Seoul, inside a low building with no visible markings on its front wall, a man named Seho received the full transmission on a personal screen at his desk. He was a historian and a strategic analyst. He had spent 31 years studying the conclave, their military history, their decision-making patterns, their collective psychology, and the long, slow arc of their relationship with humanity. He had written 4 books on the subject. He had given testimony before the Earth Federal Council twice. He knew the conclave better than most humans alive, and he had been telling people for the last decade that this day was coming. He read the declaration once, all the way through without stopping. Then he laughed. It was not a short laugh. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that a person cannot stop once it starts, the kind that fills a room. His assistant, sitting at a desk across from him, looked up with wide eyes. Seho waved a hand at her to show he was fine. He kept laughing for another few seconds, then wiped his eyes, stood up, and picked up his coat. "They finally did it," he said to no one in particular. "I was starting to think they never would." He walked down the hall and knocked on a door at the far end of the building. The door opened to a room where Admiral Junho was already awake, already seated, already reading the same declaration on a much larger screen. Junho was not a loud man. He was not the kind of person who shouted or made large gestures or filled a room with his personality. He was the kind of person who made a room feel quieter just by being in it. He had been in command of the United Earth Fleet for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 20 years in deep space operations, running missions that did not appear in any public record. Seho slid a printed copy of the declaration across the desk toward him. Junho looked at it. He already had his own copy on the screen in front of him, but he looked at Seho's printed version anyway, the way a man might look at a familiar object from a long time ago. He said nothing for a moment. Then he pressed a small button on the side of his desk and asked someone outside the room to bring tea. The War Council assembled within the hour. It was not chaotic. No one was running in corridors. No one was shouting into screens. The people who filled the room around the long table were the kind of people who had spent their entire careers preparing for exactly this moment, and now that the moment had arrived, they moved the way people move when they know what to do. Quickly, calmly, and without wasting time on feelings that could be dealt with later. Yuna arrived last. She was the chief xenodiplomacy officer for the Earth federal government, and she had personally sat across the negotiating table from conclave representatives 47 times over the course of her career. She knew how they thought. She knew what they expected from humans under pressure. She had watched them use silence as a weapon, use patience as a trap, use politeness as a kind of slow suffocation. She sat down at the table, read the declaration in full, and said nothing for 2 minutes. Then she said, "They expect us to either beg or break. They want to watch us choose between the two." Junho nodded once. "Then we will do neither," he said. The conversation that followed was not a panic debate. It was more like a review. Each person at the table had a role and they spoke in turn, laying out pieces of a picture that had been in progress for a very long time. The conclave had sent 40,000 ships to the border. Those ships were real, and their weapons were real, and underestimating them would be a mistake. But the picture was larger than 40,000 ships. It had always been larger than that. Yuna was given the task of sending the official human response to the conclave. She wrote it herself, in less than 10 minutes. It was 3 sentences long. The response said that the declaration had been received and formally logged. It said that humanity requested 72 hours to prepare a proper reply. It ended with one quiet line that was carefully, deliberately chosen. Humanity asked the conclave please not to mistake silence for fear. The message was transmitted at 5:32 hours. On the conclave's command vessel, a ship so large it created its own gravity field, Grand Admiral Vethoran read the response twice. He was surrounded by advisors, strategists, and the ambassadors of 11 member civilizations who had gathered to watch the moment humanity flinched. He read the response a 3rd time. Then he set it down and told his council that the humans were stalling. He told them what they all wanted to believe, that the calm, polite tone of the message was the sound of a species trying to hold itself together as it started to crack. His advisors agreed. His council agreed. Everyone in that room agreed because it was the only thing that made sense to them. A species facing 40,000 warships should be scared. The math was simple. No one in that room considered a different possibility. No one asked what a species that had known this day was coming for 3,000 years might have done with all that time. No one asked what silence had looked like from the inside. Back in Seoul, Junho finished his tea. He set the cup down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at the people around him. 72 hours, he said. Let's not waste them. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. People were reading the news on their phones. Some were scared. Some were angry. But in the streets, in the cafes, in the early morning markets where vendors were setting out their stalls, there was something else too, something harder to name. A kind of steadiness. As if somewhere deep down, without being able to explain it, ordinary people could feel that the ones in charge of this situation were not afraid either. They did not know why they felt that way. But they were right. The 72 hours did not feel like waiting. Not to the people inside the United Earth federal buildings. Not to the teams working in deep space stations whose locations did not appear on any public map. And certainly not to Tiho, who had not slept in 31 hours and did not appear to need to. Tiho ran the Earth Weapons Research Division. He was not famous. His name did not appear in news articles. There were no interviews with him, no public speeches, no photos of him shaking hands with politicians. He preferred it that way. He was a quiet man with a sharp face and the kind of eyes that made people feel like they were being measured every time he looked at them. He had been running the division for 19 years, and in that time he had turned it into something that had no real comparison anywhere in the known galaxy. He knew this. He was not modest about it. He simply did not talk about it in public. When the War Council called him in, he arrived with a single data drive and no presentation slides. He plugged the drive into the room's main display and spoke for 4 hours straight. The council listened without interrupting. The Conclave's intelligence network was considered one of the best in the galaxy. They had operatives inside human space, had intercepted thousands of communications over the centuries, and had built detailed models of humanity's military capability. They believed they understood what they were walking into. Their estimate was that humanity could field roughly 8,000 combat-capable ships, supported by aging defensive platforms and a collection of weapons technology that lagged behind Conclave standards by about 2 generations. That estimate was based on the 11% of human military activity that the Conclave had actually managed to observe. Tiho explained this in a flat, straightforward voice, the way a person explains something they have known for so long that it no longer surprises them. The other 89%, he said, had been developed, tested, and deployed in locations the Conclave did not know existed. Deep space, uninhabited systems, the hollow interiors of dead moons in regions that no Conclave survey ship had passed through in over 1,000 years. Humanity had not been hiding these things out of paranoia. They had been hiding them because they had looked at the Truce, all 3,000 years of it, and understood what it really was. It was not peace. It was a countdown. The first thing Tiho walked them through was the skipfold engine. Standard faster-than-light travel worked by bending the space around a ship, creating a tunnel between 2 points. Every civilization in the Conclave used some version of this. It was well understood. It was trackable. When a ship folded from one location to another, it left a signature, a brief distortion that sensors could detect, measure, and use to predict where the ship had come from and where it was going. Human engineers had spent 400 years working on a different approach. Instead of bending space around a ship, the skipfold engine folded the ship into a point that already existed in space. The difference sounded small. It was not small. A ship using skipfold technology did not leave a detectable signature. It did not create a tunnel. It simply stopped being in one place and started being in another in a fraction of a second with no trail left behind. And if the point it folded into happened to be occupied by another ship, the result was not a collision. It was something much worse. The 2 occupied points of space resolved the conflict the only way physics knew how. One of them ceased to exist entirely. Several members of the council shifted in their seats when Tiho said this. He moved on without pausing. The second thing he covered was what the research teams had quietly come to call the quiet tide. Over the course of 800 years, small automated construction ships, no larger than commercial freight vessels, registered as geological survey units, had traveled through the asteroid belts, dead moons, and debris fields that lined the edges of what the Conclave considered contested space. They had not been doing geological surveys. They had been planting things. Tiny, cold, completely inert objects that drew no power, emitted no signals, and to any scanner pointed at them, looked exactly like chunks of rock and frozen gas. There were approximately 4 billion of them. They were drones. When activated by a single encrypted signal broadcast from any human command vessel, each one would wake up, unfold, and become a fully operational combat unit capable of tracking, targeting, and destroying anything within a range of 3,000 kilometers. They could not be jammed once active, because they did not communicate with each other through radio waves or any signal the Conclave systems were designed to intercept. They communicated through a method that Tiho spent 20 minutes explaining and that most of the room only partially understood. The simple version was that once the quiet tide woke up, it was not possible to make it go back to sleep from the outside. The council sat with that for a moment. Then Tiho introduced them to Doha. Doha was the director of Earth's AI Systems Division, and he joined the meeting through a screen from a station somewhere that he did not name. He was younger than most people expected, with a calm face and the relaxed posture of a man who had already seen every version of this conversation play out in simulation. He had been running war simulations for the Earth Federal Command for over 2 decades. His systems had modeled every known Conclave fleet formation, every recorded battle strategy the Alliance had used in the last 500 years, every resource line, every supply chain, every weakness that patience and data could find. He told the Council that in the last 40 years of modeling, humanity had not lost a single simulated engagement. He said it the same way someone might say that it had not rained last Tuesday, as a fact, not a boast. The reason, he explained, was not that humanity's weapons were so far superior that victory was automatic. The reason was simpler and older than any weapon. Humanity had stopped trying to fight the way everyone else fought. Every other civilization in the galaxy, including all 17 members of the Conclave, approached war using frameworks that had been developed over thousands of years of fighting each other. They understood range, formation, supply lines, and attrition. They were very good at the kind of war they had always fought. Humanity had studied those frameworks, and then humanity had quietly decided not to use them. Instead, the simulations had produced something that looked less like traditional warfare and more like a series of problems being solved with tools the other side did not know existed. Skip-fold positioning, drone-tied activation, ghost squadron deployment, layered communication blackouts. None of it matched anything in the Conclave's historical database because none of it had ever been used before. Field Commander Sora was the last person Tiho spoke about, though she was not in the room. She was already in space. She had been in space for 9 days, since before the declaration was even officially sent. She commanded the first response Vanguard fleet, and she had moved it into position the moment the pre-declaration intelligence reports had confirmed that the Conclave was about to act. The fleet was not where anyone looking for it would think to look. Sora had made sure of that. When the 4 hours were done, the room was quiet for a long moment. Junho, who had listened to all of it without writing a single note, looked around the table. "Any questions?" he asked. No one had any. "Then everyone knows what they are doing," he said. "Let's not make this complicated." Yuna, sitting 2 seats to his left, looked at the clock on the wall. The 72 hours were almost up. She thought about the Conclave's Grand Admiral, sitting on his enormous ship at the edge of human space, watching the clock run down and imagining what was happening on the other side. She thought about what he believed he was about to face. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and went to send the second message. It was shorter than the first one. It said only what needed to be said. Humanity was ready. The Conclave could begin whenever they wished. She sent it at 4:48 hours and went to get coffee. Outside, the stars looked the same as they always had, still and cold and unbelievably far away. None of them knew what was about to happen in the space between them, but the people who did know were not afraid. They were focused and ready and very, very patient. They had been patient for 3,000 years. A little longer was nothing at all. The Conclave moved at dawn. Not Earth's dawn, there was no sun involved, no horizon, no orange light creeping across a sky. It was dawn in the way military people use the word, meaning the moment when waiting ends and action begins. At 600 hours, Conclave Standard Time, Grand Admiral Vethoran gave the order, and 40,000 ships began to move. The plan was clean. It had been designed by the Conclave's finest strategic minds over the course of 2 years, reviewed by 7 separate war councils, and approved by all 17 member civilizations. 3 fleets, moving in 3 directions at once, striking 3 separate human targets simultaneously. The outer colony at Kepler Station, the supply outpost in the Marin Belt, the deep space relay hub near Tau Ceti. These were not random targets. They had been chosen because losing all 3 at once would cut the outer edges of human-controlled space off from the center, collapse the communication network, isolate the colonies, and force the Earth Federal Fleet to split up and respond in 3 directions at the same time. A divided enemy was a manageable enemy. That was the idea. The 3 fleets moved through space in perfect formation. Vethoran watched them go on his tactical display, thousands of bright markers spreading outward like fingers reaching for 3 different points on a map. It was a good plan. He believed in it. Every advisor around him believed in it. The math was sound. The numbers were overwhelming. The targets were real and defensible and worth fighting over, and humanity's forces would have no choice but to show up and try to hold them. What the plan did not account for was that humanity's forces were already there. Not at the targets, behind the fleets. Sora had moved the first response Vanguard fleet into position 11 days ago, using skip-fold jumps that left no trail and no signature, threading her ships through the gaps in conclave sensor coverage that Doha's models had identified over 20 years of careful study. She had not gone to Kepler Station. She had not gone to the Marin Belt or Tau Ceti. She had gone behind the conclave's own staging area, into the dark space at their rear, and she had sat there in complete silence with her engines cold and her weapons powered down, waiting. She had been waiting for 9 days when the conclave fleets finally moved. She let them travel for 4 hours. She let them commit fully to their attack vectors, let them get deep enough into their own plan that turning around would be a decision, not a reflex. Then she activated the fleet. 2,000 human ships came alive at the back of the conclave's formation at the same moment. Skip-fold drives engaged. Ships vanished from their waiting positions and reappeared inside the conclave's rear columns before a single sensor operator on the other side had time to shout a warning. The strikes were fast and precise and aimed not at destroying ships but at destroying order. Command vessels, communication relays, the ships that told other ships what to do and where to go. Without those, a fleet stopped being a fleet and started being a very large collection of confused, isolated vessels with no one to coordinate them. The conclave's rear guard began to collapse within minutes. Then the quiet tide woke up. It started in the Marin Belt, because the Marin Belt was full of asteroids, and the asteroids were full of drones that had been sleeping for the better part of 8 centuries. The signal went out from one of Sora's command ships, encrypted, fast, and completely undetectable to any conclave system. And then 400 million cold, silent pieces of rock stopped being rocks. The conclave's second fleet, the one headed for the Marin Belt, flew into it the way a person walks into a wall in a dark room. They had not seen it coming because there had been nothing to see. One moment the path ahead was empty debris field, the same empty debris field their scouts had surveyed 3 times. The next moment it was filled with active combat units, surrounding them on every side, targeting their hulls with a speed and precision that no human-operated system could have matched because no human was operating them. The AI systems in each drone made 10,000 decisions per second. They did not panic. They did not hesitate. They did not need orders. The second fleet lost a third of its ships in the first 8 minutes. Aboard the Conclave flagship, Vethoran's tactical display had stopped making sense. The clean picture of 3 fleets moving toward 3 targets had turned into something that looked like someone had thrown the map into a fire. Red markers everywhere. Communication lines dropping. Fleet commanders sending messages that overlapped each other and contradicted each other and sometimes stopped mid-sentence. He stood in front of the display and tried to find the shape of what was happening, tried to find the moment where the plan had broken, so he could understand it. There was no single moment. The plan had broken everywhere at once. One of his senior officers put a channel through to his station. A human ship was hailing the flagship directly. Vethoran almost did not answer it. Then he thought that he should at least know what the enemy was saying, so he opened the channel. Junho's face appeared on the screen. He was sitting at a desk. There was a cup of something warm near his right hand. He looked like a man who was in the middle of a quiet morning and had taken a moment to make a call. "Grand Admiral," he said, "you have approximately 19 minutes before your second and third fleets are fully encircled. I would recommend using that time to contact your remaining commanders and discuss your options." Vethoran stared at him. "You are bluffing," he said. Junho looked at him calmly. "I am not. Our third fleet is still intact. Our first fleet is regrouping. You cannot encircle." "Your third fleet entered the Tau Ceti corridor 40 minutes ago," Junho said. "The corridor has been seeded with drone units for the last 600 years. The activation signal went out 17 minutes ago. Your third fleet is currently attempting to navigate a combat zone that is 300,000 kilometers wide and has no exit that is not covered." He paused. You have 18 minutes now. Vethoran turned from the screen and looked at his tactical officer. The tactical officer was already pale. He nodded once, very slightly, without speaking. Vethoran turned back to the screen. Junho had not moved. "What do you want?" Vethoran said. His voice was still steady, but something behind his eyes had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was something Vethoran had not felt in a very long time, something his species experienced rarely, and his position had protected him from almost entirely. He was afraid, and he knew it, and he could not hide it well enough. "Right now," Junho said, "I want you to call your remaining commanders and tell them to hold their positions. Do not advance. Do not attempt to retreat through the drone corridors. Your ships will not survive it. Hold position and wait. We will not fire on a stationary fleet." And then, Junho said, "We will talk." He closed the channel. In the 18 minutes that followed, the Conclave lost 4,000 more ships. Not because anyone was trying to destroy them. Most of those losses came from fleet commanders who did not receive Vethoran's hold order in time, or who received it and did not believe it, or who tried to run anyway and found out that the drone corridors were exactly as impassable as Junho had said. By the end of the first day, the count was clear. The Conclave had lost 6,004 ships. Humanity had lost 11. 7 of those 11 had been empty decoy vessels, sent out specifically to draw fire and give Conclave gunners something to feel good about hitting. Sara, sitting in her command chair aboard the lead ship of the Vanguard fleet, received the final count and read it twice. Then she sent a short message back to Junho. It said only, "First day done, all objectives met, no personnel casualties, awaiting next orders." She leaned back in her chair and looked out through the viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, across the debris fields and the silent drones and the drifting wreckage of 6,000 Conclave vessels, the rest of the galaxy was watching. Every neutral civilization, every independent world, every species that had ever quietly wondered what humanity really was, they were all receiving the same data feeds. They were all reading the same numbers. Sara wondered what they were thinking. She suspected they were finally asking the right question. The news traveled faster than the ships did. That was the nature of information in a galaxy full of civilizations that had spent thousands of years building communication networks. By the time the first day of fighting was fully over, by the time the Conclave's broken fleets had stopped moving and the drone corridors had gone quiet, the data was already spreading. Numbers, coordinates, sensor logs pulled from Conclave ships that had survived long enough to transmit, fleet positions, casualty reports. All of it moving outward from the edge of human space in every direction at once, reaching worlds that had no part in the conflict, reaching governments that had carefully stayed neutral for centuries, reaching species that had watched humanity from a careful distance for a very long time and told themselves that the distance was enough. The number that stopped everyone was not 40,000. That was the number they had started with, the number that was supposed to be overwhelming, the number designed to make the conclusion feel obvious before the fighting even began. The number that stopped everyone was 6,000. 6,000 Conclave ships gone in a single day, against 11. And when the details came through, when the analysts on neutral worlds and independent stations pulled the sensor data apart and looked at it closely, they found something that made the number even harder to sit with. 7 of the 11 human losses had been empty ships, decoys, sent out on purpose. In the government buildings of a small, peaceful civilization called the Vorelian Commonwealth, 3 days' travel from the nearest edge of Conclave space, a senior intelligence officer read the full report and then walked to a window and stood there for a while without saying anything. He had spent his career studying military conflicts. He had written papers on force ratios, on the mathematics of fleet engagements, on the historical outcomes of wars between civilizations of unequal size. Nothing in any of that work had prepared him for what he was reading. He went back to his desk and wrote a single line in his personal notes. It said, "We have all made a serious mistake in how we thought about humans." He stared at it for a moment. Then he sent an urgent message to his government's Foreign Affairs office recommending that the Commonwealth's ambassador to the conclave be recalled immediately. He was not the only one thinking this way. 3 neutral civilizations recalled ambassadors in the first 48 hours. 2 more quietly closed their observer offices in conclave territory and stopped returning conclave diplomatic calls. None of them announced this publicly. None of them needed to. The conclave noticed. The empty chairs at communication terminals and the unanswered channels were a message of their own, sent in the language of people who had decided to stop associating with something that was losing badly. The conclave's war council met in emergency session. Vethorin sat at the head of the table, and for the first time in his career he felt the table was too long and the room was too large, and the people around him were not looking at him the way they used to. The confidence that had filled the room 2 days ago, the absolute shared certainty that the plan was good and the numbers were right and humanity would fold, that confidence was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more dangerous: doubt. And underneath the doubt, though no one said it aloud, fear. The council debated for 6 hours. Some members argued for pulling back entirely, for regrouping and finding a diplomatic exit before more was lost. Others argued that retreating now would be worse than continuing, that showing weakness to a species that had just done what humanity had done would be an invitation for terms they would not like. The debate went in circles. Vethorin listened to it with the patience of a man who already knew what the council was going to decide, because pride was predictable, and the conclave had a great deal of pride. In the end, they chose to strike again. One massive, direct assault aimed at Sol itself, at Earth. It was not a strategic choice. It was an emotional one. A blow to the heart of human civilization, to the planet where all of this had started, would change the shape of the war. It would mean something. It would take back the story. That was what they told themselves. They sent what remained of their best fleet toward the Sol system. It was a powerful force. Even after the losses of the first day, the conclave could put together a strike group that by any normal measure should have been enough to threaten a home world. Vethorin watched them go and felt something loosen slightly in his chest. Action felt better than sitting. Moving felt better than waiting. He did not know about Rena. Almost no one outside of a small group of human commanders knew about Rena, and the ones who did had kept the knowledge carefully contained. She was a pilot, though the word felt small when applied to her. She had been flying since she was 17 years old, had spent 12 years in standard fleet operations before being quietly pulled sideways into a program that had no official name and no official existence. She commanded a unit called the Ghost Wing. 300 fighters, each one built around a piece of technology that Tiho's division had spent 60 years developing, and another 20 years making small enough to fit inside a single-seat craft. The technology did not destroy ships. That was the part that took people a moment to understand when they first heard it. The Ghost Wing's weapons did not fire anything. They did not punch holes in hulls or overload reactor cores or do any of the things that weapons were supposed to do. What they did was far simpler and far stranger. They reached into the space around a target vessel and folded it. Not far, not to another star system, just far enough. 3,000 light seconds, roughly. Into empty, pre-designated space, surrounded by human-holding vessels, intact and functional and suddenly very, very far from where they had been a moment ago. The ship's crew would be unharmed. The ship itself would be unharmed. It would simply no longer be where the battle was. The Conclave's strike fleet entered the outer Sol system at 1100 hours and immediately began losing ships. Not to fire, not to drones. The sensor operators on the lead vessels watched their formation with growing confusion as ships began vanishing from the display one by one. No explosion, no distress signal, no debris left behind. A ship would be there and then it would not be there, and there was no way to tell from the sensor data what had happened to it or where it had gone. Commanders called the missing ships. No answer. They sent scouts to the last known positions. Nothing there, not even a dust trail. It was the most unsettling thing the Conclave's pilots had ever experienced. Fighting something that shot back was understandable. Fighting something that made your people disappear without a trace, silently, in the middle of a formation you believed was secure, was something else entirely. It reached past military training and touched something older, something that had nothing to do with strategy. The strike fleet held formation for 40 minutes. Then it started to break apart, not because anyone ordered a retreat, but because individual ships began moving away from each other, trying to get distance from whatever was taking them, not understanding that distance made no difference. The Ghost Wing worked best on scattered targets. By the time Rena's squadron pulled back, the Conclave had lost another 2,000 ships, not destroyed, relocated, sitting in empty space thousands of light seconds away, perfectly intact, their crews shaken and silent and trying to explain to each other what had just happened. Back on Earth, Seho was giving his third interview of the day. A journalist from the Vorelian Commonwealth had reached out and asked if he would speak on record about the conflict. Seho had agreed without hesitation. He sat in front of the camera in his office and answered every question clearly and without drama. He explained the skip-fold technology. He explained the drones. He talked through the strategic decisions humanity had made over 3,000 years of preparation in language that any educated person could follow. The journalist asked him, near the end of the interview, whether humans had ever been afraid of the Conclave. Seho thought about it for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to give an honest one. "We were never afraid of them," he said. "We were aware of them. There is a difference. Fear makes you freeze. Awareness makes you prepare." He leaned forward slightly. "They confused our silence for weakness, but silence is just what preparation sounds like from the outside." The interview was broadcast on 47 different worlds within 12 hours. On most of them, people watched it twice. The war ended on a Tuesday. Not with a final battle, not with a last great clash of fleets that would be written about in history books for generations. It ended the way most things end when one side has run completely out of road, quietly, and with a great deal of paperwork. On the 73rd day of the conflict, the Galactic Sovereignty Conclave sent a formal message to the United Earth Federal Council. The message used the correct diplomatic language, the old formal phrasing that interstellar governments had been using for thousands of years to signal that they were done fighting and ready to talk. It was polite. It was carefully worded. And underneath all the careful words, it was the sound of 17 civilizations that had started a war with absolute confidence and arrived at its end with almost nothing left of that confidence at all. 3 of the 17 member states had already left the conclave by then. 2 more were in the process of leaving. The alliance that had stood for 4,000 years, that had managed the politics of 4-star systems with an iron organizational structure and a shared belief in its own permanence, was coming apart at the seams. Not because humanity had demanded it. No human had asked any conclave member to leave. They were leaving because the logic of staying had collapsed. When the thing that held an alliance together was the shared belief that it was strong, and that belief was gone, there was not much left to hold on to. Yuna received the ceasefire request and read it in full. She made herself a cup of tea, which she had been doing more often lately, and sat at her desk for a while thinking. She thought about the 47 times she had sat across a table from conclave representatives over the years. She thought about the way they had always held themselves in those meetings. The particular quality of their stillness, the way they spoke slowly and waited long before responding to anything, the way they used silence to create pressure. She had always understood what they were doing. She had never let it work. But she had always known they believed it was working, and that belief had made them comfortable, and comfortable negotiators made mistakes. They were not comfortable now. She finished her tea, set the cup down, and went to tell Junho. He was already aware. He had been tracking the diplomatic channels since before dawn and had the ceasefire request on his screen when she walked in. He looked up at her and said nothing for a moment. This was normal for Junho. He was always thinking before he spoke, always making sure that what came out of his mouth was the thing he actually meant, and not just the first thing that arrived. Bring them to the table, he said finally. Standard location, neutral ground. He paused. Tell them to send their highest council member, not a representative, the member themselves. Yuna nodded. And our terms? Junho looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was a habit he had when he was organizing his thoughts. I'll write them tonight. The negotiation table was set up on a station that floated in genuinely unclaimed space, far from any world belonging to either side. It was not a grand place. It was functional, clean, well lit, and completely without the kind of decorative intimidation that powerful governments like to use when they wanted a room to do some of the work for them. Junho had asked for it to look like a working room, not a throne room. He got what he asked for. He arrived with Yuna, Seho, and Doha. No warships in escort, just the diplomatic shuttle, plain and unmarked, docking at the station with the particular quietness of a vessel that had nothing to prove. The conclave delegation arrived on a ship 3 times the size, surrounded by a fighter escort that peeled away before entering docking range, as required by the neutral station's rules. Small things, but the kind of small things that everyone noticed. The conclave's highest surviving council member was an elder called Moravel. She was old even by her species' long standards, and she carried the weight of the last 73 days visibly. Not in weakness, exactly. More the way a structure shows strain after being tested past its limits. She sat down across from Junho and looked at him with eyes that had stopped trying to calculate and were simply seeing. Junho greeted her with courtesy and no performance. He offered water. She accepted. Then he laid the terms on the table. The room was quiet enough that the soft sound of the documents being placed down was audible to everyone in it. Moravel looked at the papers for a long time without touching them. She was clearly expecting to turn the first page and find the kind of terms that a civilization which had just won a war usually wrote. Territory taken, resources claimed, governments restructured, the machinery of defeat imposed on the losing side so that the winning side could feel the win in practical, permanent ways. She turned the first page. Then she turned the second. She read all of it before she spoke. This is everything, she said. That is everything, Junho said. There were 3 things on the list. The first was full disclosure. Every intelligence operation the Conclave had run inside human space during the 3,000-year truce, every operative, every intercepted communication, every surveillance program, handed over completely and without omission. Not as punishment, as a record. Humanity wanted to know the full shape of what had been done, so that it would be part of the permanent history of the relationship between the 2 sides. The second was recognition. Simple, clear, non-negotiable. Humanity was not a subject species. It was not a curiosity, not a problem to be managed, not a lesser thing to be watched and contained and guided from above. It was a peer civilization, with all the rights that came with that status, in every formal context where such things were decided. This would be written into conclave law, into galactic treaty record, into every document that governed how the Alliance's remaining members dealt with humanity going forward. The third was a question. One question asked directly to the highest council member present to be answered honestly and on record. The question was, why did you wait 3,000 years? Moravel sat with the papers in her hands. Around her, the members of the conclave delegation were very still. Several of them had the look of people trying to find the catch, the hidden clause, the part where the real terms revealed themselves. There was no catch. They were reading the same 3 things over and over looking for something that was not there. You want no territory, Moravel said. It was not quite a question. No, Junho said. No reparations. No. You do not want to govern us. You do not want seats on our council. You do not want access to our resources beyond what is already standard under galactic trade agreements. That is correct. Moravel set the papers down very carefully. She looked at Junho the way a person looks at something they have completely misunderstood for a very long time and are only now beginning to see clearly. Then what do you want? She said, and she meant it as a genuine question, not a strategic one. She truly did not know. Junho was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was, even patient, without heat. "We want to be left alone to be what we are," he said. "We always did. That is all we ever wanted." Moravelle closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and looked down at the third point on the list. The question. She was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that fills a room completely, the kind that tells everyone in it to wait. "We waited," she said finally, "because you never seemed afraid, and we did not know what to do with that." Junho nodded slowly. He accepted the answer. He did not comment on it or push further. He simply moved the signing documents across the table. The treaty was signed at 1423 hours. It was not given a number. It was not called a truce. It was called an accord, which meant a different thing. A truce was two sides agreeing to stop. An accord was two sides agreeing to something. In a cafe in Seoul, 2 weeks later, Rena sat across from Doha at a small table near a window. The news on the screen above the counter was talking about the accord, about the conclave's restructuring, about the neutral civilizations that were now sending their own diplomatic teams to Earth for the first time. A child at the next table was arguing loudly with her older brother over the last piece of something sweet. Outside the window, a man was walking a dog. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing music badly and cheerfully on an instrument that did not deserve what was being done to it. Rena watched the screen for a while, then she turned away from it. "Do you think they finally understand?" she asked. Doha thought about 3,000 years of preparation, about the drones in the asteroid belts and the ships in the dark, and the simulations that had run for decades and the quiet, patient, completely unsentimental work of a species that had looked at the future clearly and decided to be ready for it. "No," he said, "but they will." Rena smiled. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the city moved around them the way cities always did, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, completely unaware of how close things had come or how long it had taken to make sure they stayed safe. That was fine. That was exactly how it was supposed to be. The people who needed to know had always known, and the people who needed to be ready had always been ready. That had been enough, and it always would be.